Marcus Webb stood near the back of the Grand Assembly Hall, his tablet held at an angle that suggested he was taking notes, while actually serving as a barrier between himself and the overwhelming sensory experience of being in a room with several hundred Valorians, all engaged in animated pre-session conversation. He'd been on the Valorian homeworld for 8 months as a human cultural observer, a position that sounded more prestigious than it actually was. Mostly, he attended public events, documented social customs, filed reports about Valorian cultural practices, and tried not to draw attention to himself in a society where his natural human temperament felt constantly inadequate. The Valorians were impressive in every sense. Tall, averaging close to 2 meters, with powerful builds and commanding presence that made humans look diminished by comparison. Their skin displayed subtle patterns that shifted and changed when they spoke, creating visual layers of communication that Marcus's translator implant could detect but not fully interpret. Their voices carried harmonics that conveyed emotional subtext and social positioning in ways human vocal cords couldn't replicate, and human ears struggled to fully perceive. But what challenged Marcus most was their communication culture. Valorians prized eloquence, confident speech, and the ability to command attention through voice. Children were encouraged from young age to speak boldly, to claim space through verbal assertion, to never show hesitation or uncertainty in public discourse. Silence was generally interpreted as having nothing to contribute, and speaking quietly was often read as lack of conviction or confidence. For Marcus, whose human upbringing had valued thoughtful restraint and considered reflection before speech, Valorian social norms were exhausting. Every public gathering felt like being in a room where everyone was slightly too loud, speaking slightly too confidently, taking up slightly too much space with their voices. Today's gathering was the monthly public audience session, a tradition where any Valorian citizen could address Queen Sythara directly, present petitions, or discuss matters of civic concern. It was considered both governmental function and cultural performance. Speakers were judged not just on the merit of their arguments, but on their delivery, confidence, and ability to hold the assembly's attention. Marcus was here because his position required attendance at significant cultural events. He'd learned to position himself near the back of the hall, take minimal notes, and try to manage the overwhelming wash of sound and assertive energy that characterized these sessions. The pre-session conversations were already intense. Hundreds of Valorians engaged in overlapping discussions, their voices creating a constant roar that made his translator implant struggle to isolate individual threads. The patterns on their skin shifted rapidly as they spoke, creating a visual cacophony that added to Marcus's sensory overload. He focused on his tablet, reviewing the session's agenda and trying to mentally prepare for several hours of confident, loud presentations that would leave him exhausted and overstimulated. The Queen's entrance was announced with harmonics that cut through the conversational noise. The assembly rose in unified gesture of respect, hands placed over hearts, heads bowed briefly, before settling into their seats as Queen Sythara made her way to the throne. She was imposing even by Valorian standards. Tall and powerfully built, with skin patterns that displayed the complex configurations indicating high status and accumulated wisdom. Her bearing radiated authority that needed no vocal reinforcement, though her voice, when she spoke, carried harmonics that Marcus's implant rendered as confidence, measured wisdom, and absolute certainty of position. "Citizens of valor," she began, her voice filling the hall without apparent effort. "We gather for public audience, as is our tradition. Let all who speak do so with clarity and conviction. Let all who listen do so with attention and respect." The assembly responded with a vocalization Marcus had learned was formal acknowledgement, a harmonized sound that his human throat couldn't properly reproduce. The session began. Speakers approached the throne one by one, presenting their cases with varying degrees of eloquence but universal confidence. No one hesitated. No one spoke quietly. Every presentation was delivered with the assertive energy that Valorian culture valued. Marcus took notes on his tablet, documenting the proceedings while managing his growing discomfort with the relentless volume and intensity. His human nervous system wasn't built for this level of sustained stimulation. He could feel his shoulders tensing, his jaw clenching, his attention fragmenting as his brain struggled to process the overwhelming input. He developed coping strategies over his months here, focusing on his tablet screen to reduce visual stimulation, using breathing techniques to manage his stress response, taking brief mental breaks by letting his attention drift rather than trying to process every word. About an hour into the session, a child stepped forward to present a petition. The child was young, perhaps equivalent to human 10 or 11 years, though Valorian development patterns made precise age comparisons difficult. They were accompanied by an adult, probably a parent, who stood to the side while the child approached the throne alone. The child spoke with remarkable confidence for their age, their voice carrying clearly across the hall. "Your Majesty, I petition on behalf of students in the Northern Educational District. Our facilities lack adequate resources for advanced sciences. We require updated equipment and expanded library access to maintain educational standards equal to the central districts." The volume and assertiveness were jarring to Marcus, not because the child was being inappropriate. This was exactly how Valorian children were trained to participate in civic discourse. But the sheer confidence, the lack of any hesitation or modulation, the way the child's voice filled the space with such certainty despite their youth, it triggered Marcus's overwhelmed response. He found himself lowering his gaze, looking down at his tablet rather than watching the child's presentation. It was an instinctive response to overstimulation, a way of reducing input when his capacity for processing was exceeded. He wasn't trying to be disrespectful. He just needed to create some mental distance from the intensity of the child's performance. The child continued speaking, their petition well-structured and delivered with increasing passion. Other audience members were clearly impressed. Marcus could hear murmurs of approval, could see, in his peripheral vision, the skin patterns that indicated positive reception. But Marcus kept his eyes down, breathing carefully, managing his internal response to stimulation that felt like too much despite knowing it was perfectly normal for this culture. He was so focused on his own management that he didn't notice the shift in the hall's atmosphere until it was too late. Queen Sythara's voice cut through the child's presentation like a blade through silk. One word, spoken with harmonics that made every being in the hall go instantly, profoundly silent. Enough. The word carried undertones Marcus's implants struggled to fully render. Authority, certainly, but also something else, concern, protection, a quality that didn't quite translate into standard. The child stopped mid-sentence, their mouth still open in shock. The assembly fell into silence so complete that Marcus could hear his own breathing, suddenly loud in the absence of the constant wash of Valorian voices. He looked up instinctively, drawn by the abrupt change in the hall's atmosphere. Queen Sythara was standing, a gesture that apparently carried enormous significance because several nobles actually gasped audibly, their skin patterns flashing through rapid color changes that Marcus's limited understanding associated with shock. The queen wasn't looking at the child exactly. Her gaze swept across the assembly, tracking through the crowd with deliberate precision until it settled on Marcus standing near the back wall. "The human observer," she said, her voice carrying clearly despite being notably quieter than it had been. "Marcus Webb of Earth, step forward." Marcus's stomach dropped into his feet. Every eye in the hall turned toward him, hundreds of Valorians watching as he stood frozen near the back, his tablet still clutched in suddenly sweating hands. He'd been trying to remain invisible. He just wanted to manage his overstimulation quietly. And now the queen herself had singled him out in front of the entire assembly for reasons he couldn't begin to understand. "Cultural observer Webb, the Queen repeated, her tone making clear this was not optional. Approach. Marcus made his way forward through the assembly, which parted to create a path. The silence remained absolute. He could feel the weight of hundreds of gazes tracking his movement, could see the rapid skin pattern shifts that indicated intense curiosity or concern or judgment. He couldn't always distinguish which. He reached the space before the throne and executed what he hoped was an appropriate bow. Though he'd never been entirely certain, he performed the gesture correctly. His hands were shaking slightly. He tried to keep his breathing steady and his expression neutral. "Your Majesty," he managed, his voice sounding weak and human after the confident Valorian speech that had filled the hall for the past hour. "You lowered your eyes," Queen Sythara stated. It wasn't quite a question, but her tone suggested she expected explanation. Yes, Your Majesty. I apologize if that was disrespectful to the young petitioner." "I didn't mean to." "You misunderstand my observation," she interrupted, her tone gentle despite the formal setting. "I am not accusing you of disrespect. I am noting that you lowered your eyes during the child's presentation. This is significant." She turned to address the assembly, her voice carrying that quality of speaking to teach rather than merely inform. "I have spent considerable time studying human cultural practices as part of our ongoing diplomatic relations with Earth. Humans lower their eyes for many reasons, some similar to our customs, some quite different. But I have learned that when a human lowers their eyes in a public setting while remaining physically present and attentive, it often indicates they are carrying burden or managing distress that others cannot see." She focused on Marcus again, her expression impossible to read but her skin patterns showing configurations that might have indicated concern. "Is this accurate in your case, cultural observer Webb?" Marcus struggled to find appropriate words, acutely aware that he was now the center of attention in a way that made his earlier overstimulation seem mild by comparison. The child was speaking with great confidence and considerable volume, as is normal and appropriate in your culture. He tried to keep his voice steady, tried to explain without sounding like he was criticizing. For humans, sustained exposure to that level of assertive presentation can be overwhelming. I lowered my eyes to manage my discomfort. I wasn't trying to be rude to the child. I was just managing my own capacity to remain present. "You were not being rude," Queen Sythara said firmly, her voice carrying absolute conviction. "You were exercising restraint and self-management in a situation that challenged your comfort. This is a quality my people often fail to recognize because we equate silence with absence of contribution, lowered eyes with lack of engagement or disrespect." She turned to the child, who had been standing in confused and increasingly anxious silence during this exchange. Her tone softened but remained clear. "Young citizen, your petition was well presented. Your confidence and clarity of speech demonstrate excellent training. Your passion for educational resources is commendable and will be given serious consideration." She paused, "But your volume and intensity, while completely normal and appropriate by our cultural standards, were causing distress to an honored guest in this assembly. A guest who was managing his discomfort with quiet dignity, rather than interrupting your presentation to demand you accommodate his different needs." The child looked stricken. I didn't know. I didn't mean to cause distress to anyone." "Of course you didn't," the Queen said, her tone gentle. "You were doing exactly what our culture teaches, speaking with confidence, claiming space with your voice, presenting your case boldly. These are values." The assembly remained in profound silence, clearly processing what their queen had just demonstrated. Marcus stood before the throne feeling exposed and uncomfortable, wishing desperately that he'd never lowered his eyes, that he could somehow disappear back into the anonymous crowd. But Queen Sythara wasn't finished. She settled back onto her throne with deliberate gravity and continued addressing her people. "We Valorians pride ourselves on eloquence, on confident speech, on the ability to command attention through voice and presence. These are indeed valuable qualities. They have served us well in governance, in diplomacy, in the building of our civilization. But she paused for emphasis. We have perhaps forgotten to equally value other qualities. The restraint to remain silent when speech would only add noise. The humility to acknowledge when we are overwhelmed rather than performing strength we do not feel. The dignity of enduring discomfort without demanding others change to accommodate us. She gestured toward Marcus, who wished he could sink through the floor. This human has attended our public gatherings for 8 months. He takes his notes quietly. He observes our customs with respect. He asks thoughtful questions when appropriate. He does not demand we lower our voices to suit his comfort. He does not insist we adopt human communication styles. He simply manages his own responses and continues his work despite ongoing discomfort with our cultural norms. Her gaze swept across the assembled nobles and citizens. How many of us even noticed his presence before today? How many registered that he was managing difficulty with composure rather than complaint? How many saw his lowered eyes and recognized them as sign of unseen burden rather than disengagement? The silence that followed felt weighted with acknowledgement and perhaps shame. Today I chose to interrupt a citizen's petition, something I do not do lightly and have rarely done in my years of rule, because I observed someone exercising quiet dignity in a moment of invisible burden. The human did not know anyone was watching his response. He was not performing humility for an audience or attempting to manipulate through apparent weakness. He was simply being human in a space that challenges him, managing that challenge with composure that deserved recognition. She leaned forward slightly, her posture conveying the importance of what she was about to say. I ask each of you, what would it mean for our culture if we learned to honor restraint as much as assertion? If we recognized that not all strength announces itself loudly? If we created space for those who contribute through presence and careful observation rather than confident speech? Queen Sythara focused on Marcus again. Cultural observer Webb, tell this assembly. In your human culture, what does it mean when someone lowers their eyes during a difficult situation? Marcus cleared his throat, acutely aware of hundreds of Valorians watching him with intense curiosity. His voice came out quieter than intended, though he tried to speak clearly. In human culture, it varies by specific background, Your Majesty, but generally, lowering your eyes can mean several things. Sometimes it's respect, especially in hierarchical situations. Sometimes it's submission. But often, he paused, searching for the right explanation, it's a way of managing overwhelming input. When we're dealing with something difficult or intense, looking down helps us process without additional visual stimulation. It's not weakness exactly. It's choosing to engage with internal experience rather than continuing to perform external attention when our capacity is exceeded. Internal experience rather than external performance, the Queen repeated, her tone suggesting she was highlighting something significant. This is precisely the distinction I wish this assembly to understand. Not all strength is loud. Not all wisdom speaks constantly. Not all dignity demands to be seen or acknowledged. She stood again, this time with the clear intention of making formal pronouncement. I am revising the protocols for public audience sessions, effective immediately. All speakers will be reminded before presenting to observe their audience for signs of distress or discomfort, not just to gauge approval or disapproval through vocal response. We will incorporate periods of silence into these sessions, moments for reflection rather than constant speech. And we will formally acknowledge that restraint, composure, and quiet management of difficulty are qualities worthy of respect and honor in this hall and throughout Valorian civic life. The assembly received this with mixed reactions visible in shifting skin patterns. Marcus saw colors that indicated approval, others suggesting uncertainty or confusion, a few that might have been resistance or disagreement. but no one spoke against the Queen's pronouncement. That would apparently violate protocols that were stronger than personal disagreement. Queen Sythara addressed the child who had been presenting the petition. "Young citizen, you have done nothing wrong. Your presentation was exactly what our culture teaches and values, but you have also given all of us an opportunity to learn something important, that there are forms of communication and strength beyond volume and confidence. I hope you will carry this learning forward in your continued civic participation, not by diminishing your voice, but by developing awareness of those who may be quietly managing challenges you cannot see." She gestured for the child to return to their place, then made a broader gesture encompassing the whole assembly. "We will continue with the remaining petitions, but I instruct all speakers to be mindful not just of their own eloquence, but of their audience's capacity to engage. Strength includes knowing when to moderate volume, when to pause for reflection, when to observe those who remain quiet not from lack of engagement, but from the dignity of managing unseen burden with composure." The session resumed, but the atmosphere had fundamentally changed. Subsequent speakers were noticeably more aware of their audience, pausing more frequently, moderating their volume slightly. Several explicitly acknowledged those who contribute through presence and observation rather than speech. Marcus returned to his position near the back, but he was no longer invisible. Multiple Valorians approached him during the session break, some to apologize for not noticing his discomfort, others to ask questions about human communication norms, a few to express confusion or mild defensiveness about the Queen's intervention. He handled these interactions as diplomatically as possible, emphasizing that he hadn't been complaining about Valorian customs and hadn't expected or wanted special accommodation. But his words seemed less important than the Queen's public acknowledgement of his quiet endurance. When the session finally concluded, hours later, and with Marcus more exhausted than ever despite the somewhat reduced intensity, he attempted to slip away quietly. But Queen Sythara's aide intercepted him before he reached the exit. "Cultural Observer Webb, Her Majesty requests private audience." Marcus followed the aide through corridors he'd never accessed, into a smaller chamber where Queen Sythara waited with only 2 guards present. Her demeanor was less formally regal, though she still carried unmistakable authority. "Please sit," she said, gesturing to a chair across from her own. "I imagine today was uncomfortable for you in ways beyond the original overstimulation that prompted your lowered eyes." Marcus sat carefully. "Your Majesty, I don't know what to say. I wasn't trying to criticize Valorian culture or make anyone feel bad about their communication style. I was just managing my own response. I know. That is precisely why your behavior was worth highlighting." The Queen's skin patterns shifted through configurations that suggested she was choosing her words carefully. "Tell me honestly, how often do you experience discomfort or overwhelm during Valorian public gatherings?" "Most of the time, Your Majesty. The volume, the constant assertive energy, the lack of pauses for reflection. It's challenging for my human nervous system. But I understood this when I accepted the cultural observer position. I knew I would need to adapt to your norms rather than expecting accommodation. And you have adapted, with considerable grace and minimal complaint." She leaned back in her chair. "But adaptation has costs. I have watched you at several public events over the past months. I have seen you position yourself near exits, manage your visible responses, and lower your eyes periodically when stimulation becomes excessive. You were not invisible, Cultural Observer Webb. You were simply quiet about your struggle." She paused. "Today I chose to make that quiet struggle visible because I believe my people have become unbalanced in our values. We reward confident assertion so heavily that we have forgotten to honor restraint, humility, and quiet strength. Your presence, managing discomfort with dignity rather than demanding accommodation, reminded me of what we have lost." Marcus sat in the private chamber with Queen Sythara, still processing everything that had happened. The Queen seemed to be waiting for him to respond, so he gathered his thoughts carefully. "Your Majesty, I appreciate your recognition of whatever you saw in my behavior, but I worry that drawing attention to my discomfort might have created resentment among your people. Some of the nobles who approached me seemed defensive, as if my struggle was implicit criticism of Valorian culture." "Some were defensive," the Queen acknowledged. "This is to be expected when a culture's foundational values are challenged, but many more were curious or thoughtful. The nobles who approached you, how many expressed defensiveness versus genuine interest in understanding human communication differences?" Marcus considered. "Honestly, mostly curiosity. A few were defensive, but most seemed interested in learning about the differences." "Then the lesson was received more positively than you fear." Queen Sythara's skin patterns shifted to configurations that might have indicated satisfaction. "I did not highlight your quiet endurance to embarrass you or to criticize my people. I did it because leadership sometimes requires making invisible struggles visible, especially when those struggles reveal something important about our cultural blind spots." She stood and moved to a window overlooking the palace grounds. "We Valorians have built a civilization on confident speech and assertive presence. These qualities have served us well, but they have also created a society where those who are naturally quieter, more reflective, or simply managing challenges we cannot see are often overlooked or devalued." "Your own people must experience this too," Marcus observed. "Not just humans dealing with Valorian norms. There must be Valorians who struggle with the constant expectation of confident speech." "Yes, and they are often considered weak or insufficiently developed." The Queen's tone carried notes that Marcus's implants suggested indicated regret or concern. "By honoring your quiet dignity publicly, I was also speaking to those Valorians who have felt diminished by their inability to match our cultural ideals of constant, confident assertion." She returned to her seat. "I want to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. Do you believe it is possible for humans and Valorians to genuinely understand each other, given how fundamentally different our communication values are?" Marcus thought carefully before responding. "I think understanding is always possible, Your Majesty, but it requires both sides acknowledging that their way isn't the only valid way. Valorians value confident speech and assertive presence. These are real strengths. Humans often value restraint and careful reflection. These are also real strengths. Neither is inherently better, but each culture tends to assume its approach is universal or superior." "Well said." The Queen's expression showed something that might have been approval. "This is why I chose to interrupt that child's petition. Not because they were wrong, they weren't, but because their rightness according to our cultural norms was inadvertently causing harm to someone exercising different but equally valid strengths. That contradiction needed to be made visible." She leaned forward slightly. "You lowered your eyes not because you were weak or disengaged, but because you were managing your capacity to remain present despite difficulty. That is strength my people need to learn to recognize and honor. And I, as their queen, must model that recognition." Over the following weeks, Marcus noticed subtle but real changes in how Valorians interacted with him and with each other. Some speakers at public gatherings moderated their volume slightly and incorporated pauses for reflection. Several nobles made explicit efforts to check in with quieter attendees rather than only engaging with the most vocal participants. The changes were gradual and not universal, but they suggested Queen Sythara's intervention had catalyzed something meaningful. The child whose petition had been interrupted sought Marcus out at a subsequent gathering. They approached with visible nervousness, their skin patterns showing colors associated with uncertainty. "Cultural Observer Webb, I wanted to apologize for causing you distress during my petition. I didn't know humans experienced our speech differently." "You didn't do anything wrong," Marcus assured them sincerely. You were participating exactly as your culture teaches. I was simply managing my own response to differences between our species. The Queen was right that neither of us was at fault. We were both being who we are. She said that noticing people who are quiet is important, the child said, their patterns shifting to colors that might have indicated thoughtful processing. That not all strength is loud. I'm trying to understand what that means practically, but it's hard. Marcus considered how to explain to a young Valorian raised in a culture of confident assertion. It means paying attention to more than just who speaks most confidently. It means watching for people who seem uncomfortable or overwhelmed, even if they don't say anything about it. It means sometimes asking if someone needs a quieter space or a break, rather than assuming everyone has the same capacity for constant engagement. He paused. It also means recognizing that someone being quiet doesn't mean they have nothing to contribute. Sometimes the quietest people are processing deeply or managing something you can't see. Their silence is engagement, just different from vocal participation. The child absorbed this with visible effort. That's much harder than just speaking confidently. Yes, Marcus agreed, but valuable, and honestly, learning to manage my overstimulation quietly in Valorian spaces is also hard. We're all adapting to each other. That's what cross-cultural understanding requires. Months later, as Marcus prepared to complete his term and return to Earth, he drafted his final cultural report. He included extensive analysis of Valorian communication norms, but also reflection on what Queen Sythara had done. The Queen's unprecedented interruption of a citizen's petition to acknowledge my quiet management of discomfort represents significant intervention in Valorian cultural norms. By silencing confident speech to honor restrained endurance, she challenged her society's deeply held equation of volume with value, assertiveness with strength, and constant vocal participation with meaningful engagement. The incident sparked ongoing discussion about what forms of communication and presence deserve recognition in Valorian civic life. Some Valorians remain resistant to any implication that their expressive norms have limitations or costs, but many have begun incorporating greater awareness of quiet dignity, restraint, and the invisible burdens people carry while remaining present and composed. This represents meaningful cultural evolution, catalyzed by one moment of royal attention to someone who believed himself invisible. Queen Sythara saw my lowered eyes not as disrespect or disengagement, but as a sign of strength her culture had forgotten to honor. By making that recognition public, she gave permission for her people to value forms of contribution beyond confident speech and assertive presence. Marcus paused in his writing, remembering the moment when he'd looked up from his tablet to find the Queen standing, addressing the assembly about his quiet endurance, making his invisible struggle visible in ways that had been profoundly uncomfortable, but also deeply respectful. She had noticed him when he was trying not to be seen. She had interrupted civic business to acknowledge that his lowered eyes indicated strength rather than weakness. And she had taught her people, or at least begun to teach them, that not all valuable contribution announces itself loudly, that restraint and composure deserve honor even in the most assertive and vocal of cultures. A child had spoken too loudly for his human comfort. The Queen had silenced that child before everyone, not in anger, not in punishment, but in recognition that quiet dignity managing unseen burden was worthy of protection and acknowledgement even in the loudest halls of power. It had been extraordinarily uncomfortable, but it had also been one of the most respectful things anyone had ever done for Marcus, seeing his struggle, naming it publicly, and declaring it valuable not despite its quietness, but because restraint and composure were strengths her people needed to remember to honor. He finished his report and submitted it to his human superiors, along with his recommendation that future cultural observers receive more extensive preparation for the sustained overstimulation of Valorian public spaces. But he also noted that Valorian culture was more capable of growth and adaptation than initial assessment might suggest. When leadership modeled recognition of different strengths, the people could follow. On his final day, Queen Sythara granted him one more private audience. "You are returning to Earth," she observed. "Do you leave with positive or negative impressions of Valorian culture?" "Both, Your Majesty," Marcus answered honestly. "Your people's confidence and eloquence are genuinely impressive, but the sustained intensity was constantly challenging for my human nervous system. I learned a great deal, but I also reached my limits repeatedly. And yet you remained. You managed your difficulties with quiet dignity." She stood and approached him, extending her hand in the human gesture of farewell rather than the Valorian gesture. "You taught my people something important simply by being yourself, by struggling visibly enough for those who looked closely, but managing that struggle with composure rather than complaint." She paused. "I honored your lowered eyes not because you asked for recognition, but because quiet strength deserves acknowledgement especially when, it does not demand to be seen. I hope your time here, though challenging, has shown you that your human restraint and careful reflection are valuable qualities, not inadequacies that need correction." Marcus shook her hand, feeling the strange texture of Valorian skin against his human palm. "Thank you, Your Majesty, for seeing something I thought was invisible, for making it matter." "It always mattered," she replied. "I simply made that truth visible to people who had forgotten how to see it." As Marcus's transport lifted from the Valorian homeworld, he looked down at the palace complex where he'd spent 8 challenging months. He'd gone there as a cultural observer, expecting to document an alien society while remaining invisible and uninvolved. Instead, he'd been seen, profoundly, uncomfortably, respectfully seen, by a queen who recognized that his lowered eyes indicated not weakness but strength of a kind her culture had forgotten to value. A child had spoken loudly, a human had looked down, and a queen had silenced the hall to honor quiet dignity. It was a lesson Marcus would carry with him always, that sometimes the most powerful recognition comes not from demanding attention but from someone noticing your struggle, naming it clearly, and declaring it worthy of honor in the loudest halls of power.